friends, and welcome to another episode of Fully Booked. I'm Megan.
And I'm Shireen.
And it is Women's History Month,
Woo.
which we, technically introduced last week, but we're going to keep talking about it this week anyway.
And all month.
Yeah. On the podcast and over on our website too at fullybooked.ca. So you guys can always head over there to check out everything that we already have sort of spoken about as far as women in literature. We do it on a pretty regular basis anyway, I think. Yeah. But also, anything new that we have coming out from our lovely and teeny tiny team of contributors who are great and they help us when we should help ourselves more and write more than we do. So
fair.
Yeah.
That's a fair assessment. Shout out to you guys.
Yeah, exactly. But we thought this week that we might, I guess, take a step back a little bit and look a little bit into the history of women in literature as a whole, kind of, in the sense of, how things started and a lot of the difficulties that were faced by women when it came to trying to get work taken seriously and published in the first place, which of course we all know because for whatever reason, women have had to fight harder for everything that they've achieved for some reason as a gender, and God knows why, but here we are, still having to do it in a lot of cases as well.
It makes no sense. We are literally 50 to 51% of the population.
Yeah, and, we have this whole wonderful thing where we, have to be able to carry children and help the world continue to function by procreating and doing all of these really interesting things with our bodies that nothing, the world would be dead if women didn't exist anymore. Everybody would die out.
Let us use our brains and give us some respect as well. Yeah. Jeez, why is it so hard?
Wouldn't that be nice? I'm about 80% sure that women have a higher pain threshold than men do because of things like childbirth and menstruation. And nobody talks about that, but I'm pretty sure that it's true. So we thought that basically we would just sit down and have a candid chat today about what it meant to be a woman in literature back in the day, and I think what it means to be one now.
Yep.
And what that looks like for everybody. So I guess if we go back to the beginnings of things, we're talking 1700s, roughly, things like that, probably, that women started, more women, I think, were coming forward to begin to at least attempt to, first of all, they were writing stories because education was slowly but surely being allowed to happen for some of the upper classes and things a little bit more, which helps. Being able to read and write helps a lot.
Yeah.
But also, along with that, I think women were taking that and being like, oh, hey, look at that. I'm feeling a little bit more independent.
I can do this thing too.
Yeah, hey, I'm pretty good at this. I would also like to have my work published like every man that I'm around in every upper echelon of everything, everywhere.
It's true. And it's important to note also that I think the first official novel came out in the 1600s.
Yeah.
Which was Journal of the Plague Year.
Yes,
that was,
the first official
novel,
fiction.
a work of fiction.
Work of fiction, yeah.
So, women were not that far behind.
But they were 100 years behind.
About 100 years. And, of course, you can understand from, everything that Megan just said, education standpoint.
Yeah.
It's not to say that they didn't have the stories in their minds.
Oh, no, not at all. But putting it down to paper when no one's taught you how to write is a very difficult thing to do. How would you do that? So
yeah, for sure.
So I do think that that's kind of when things started slowly but surely, and then if you get into things like the 1800s, that's when you start to see a lot more women who were able to publish work. However, much of the time that work was being published under pseudonyms as well, under pen names that were largely male, obviously, because again, most of these women either wanted to remain anonymous because they felt it would be frowned upon, or they wanted to be taken seriously in some way, shape, or form, or both of those things.
Yeah.
So they would choose to, that's it, they would submit work and everything, but use a male pen name when doing so.
Yeah, and I think, women like Jane Austen published under her name.
She did, yeah.
But if you look at the Bronte sisters, they all published under male pseudonyms. And Marianne Evans, who's mostly known as George Eliot, but I know about 2 years ago, there's a project that was kicked off called the Reclaim Her Name Project, where they republished many works of fiction under the writer's real name. And exactly like Megan just said, women didn't want to because they didn't dare, or they just didn't think that they would succeed. But George Eliot, I think she made a comment at one point that she preferred to write as a man because she didn't want to be associated with the wailings of women. But that was kind of aimed directly at Jane Austen.
Yeah.
I wonder if George Eliot felt that Jane Austen was doing a disservice to women by writing the works that she did write about wanting to find a husband and wanting to, make your way up in society. And, like we always say, there's nothing wrong with having dreams like that when other women may not see the world that way. But I think it may have caused a little bit of friction in the literature world.
I think that it's sort of a difficult thing. Okay, so, you and I have talked about this before in the sense that neither of us are huge Jane Austen fans in the sense that we tend to find a lot of her stuff is like a little fluffy and overrated, and I don't really, I guess, understand like the amount of hype that she's retained versus other female authors, particularly ones from around, let's say, the same time period. However, at the same time, I will applaud, first of all, that she was able to use her own name to publish all of her works. Second of all, that they have endured the way that they have to the degree that they have. And also, that I think that she might have been intelligent about what she was doing because she chose to write the types of stories that she did, which, like you said, had a lot to do with society and societal norms and marriage and finding love and romance and all of those things. But I think in tapping into that side of the story, she was making sure that her stories would be probably seen and heard above other people's and for herself as well. Like under her own name, she wasn't hiding from it or doing anything.
And I think there's also something to say about Jane Austen appealing to an entire generation of young women who may not have been reading
that's it. Because,
for fun at this point.
As opposed to for educational purposes. Yeah.
Like I can just imagine, think of how we are kind of even today, some people don't really like reading, and then you present them with like a news, what's the word? A magazine that talks about gossip or something, and they'll read that.
Yeah, for sure.
So maybe that's what maybe that's what Jane Austen was at the time. She was appealing to a much broader audience. She was tapping into a market, air quotes, that wasn't really
that people weren't really doing before, because largely what you were getting around that time, other than, when Jane Austen herself started publishing more, was, yes, there was romance in the stories, but it was largely Gothic romance, so things tended to be very sad, very bleak, and didn't regularly have an incredibly happy ending for characters. Endings tended to be a lot more melancholic in a way. And, many of the characters, like if you look at things like Wuthering Heights and even Jane Eyre and all of those sorts of stories, you get through it and you're like, oh, I thought that was supposed to be a romance.
And you're like, I don't know where the romance began and ended, but I just feel sad now. Yeah. Well, Jane Austen did write a Gothic novel, but it didn't really have the same vibes.
No. It was a very light-hearted Gothic
Abbey.
Yeah, it's a very light-hearted Gothic novel in comparison to the Gothic literature that was being published at that time, which is actually Gothic and speculative fiction is a niche that a lot of women tapped into, and a lot of them were publishing those pulp sort of stories and things which were considered silly whatevers at the time, crazy Gothic fiction at the time. Those were being published in a lot of different periodicals and things, and a lot of women again were publishing in those sorts of periodicals under pseudonyms. And that's something, because I think that's something that's interesting that people don't always appreciate, is that women have had a really big hand in the sort of the market of Gothic darker fiction, horror, thriller, those sorts of things. Women have to this day have a huge hand in those types of speculative, very very dark kind of fiction. I don't think people associate women writing with that. They associate it more with like romance or something, but I think that that's something that should be appreciated as well, is that you have these sort of like titans of the industry when you're looking at someone like Mary Shelley or whatnot, who made their entire career on like very, very heavy stories, very like spooky stories and stuff, and a lot of women like really were only focused on publishing stories like that as well. So I do think that Jane Austen was really intelligent about what she did, and obviously she was good at it. Okay, there's nothing to say that she wasn't. Not at all.
It wouldn't have survived this long if she wasn't.
Not possible. But I think I do find it unfortunate sometimes that she's like so reviled to this day for these sorts of stories, like the romance stories that she wrote, and other women who were writing these like really effective, like, you know, effective like gothic like tragic stories and like
social commentary,
and like the social commentary and the commentaries on classism that would come along with a lot of the stories that were being written aren't as appreciated, which I do find is unfortunate.
I agree with you. There's such a vast array of different writings that are out there by women, and I think the more you dig and the more you realize that many of them were writing under male pseudonyms, it kind of broadens your perspective, and you realize that, you know, again, like we said, they were educated kind of at a later date to men, but they were listening and observing, and, you know, and so it's just I just find it really fascinating to look at it from a historical perspective that way. I don't know what the deal was with all of them using George as a pseudonym.
Oh my God, yeah. we were looking into things earlier, and we discovered that there were at least 6 or 7 women who were publishing roughly in the same time period, and who were all using, for some reason, their pen names all started with George. And I don't know if they had an unspoken agreement.
I don't know.
Or if it just George is an easy name. I don't know.
I don't know if it was like kind of like a hey, like wink wink, like other female authors, like I'm a George too. I kind of hope so. Like, I feel like if we dug far enough, maybe there might be a comment about that.
If anybody knows, hit us up and let us know, because I would be very curious to know whether or not that's actually the case, and they were all just like having a little laugh at the public's expense. People who had no idea, obviously, that these were women publishing these stories, and just thought like, boy, there's an influx of really talented Georges in the literary world, aren't there?
I know that George Eliot, so Marianne Evans, she wrote stories like Middlemarch, Adam Bede, very renowned stories. Charles Dickens actually wrote to her when she started publishing, and expressing his admiration and curiosity for her. And apparently she said to her publisher that it was really too bad that she couldn't go public with her identity, because she felt that there was a big piece missing if the readers didn't understand that she was a woman.
Like in the way that you understand the story.
And so, but I think eventually, due to like people in her social circle and kind of word sort of getting out, she finally revealed her identity, I believe in 1861, but she wrote a lot of books before then.
Yeah. So, I mean, okay. So luckily, like we said, there are a few standouts. There were women who were able to break those barriers. Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, although Mary Shelley originally published Frankenstein under a male pseudonym as well.
That was going to be my question.
And then I think flippity flopped, probably not too long after, I don't think, after it had been published. But initially, when she published the original story, I think in a periodical before it actually became a full novel, I believe she published it under a male name.
So did Louisa May Alcott for Little Women. So did the Bronte sisters, all 3 of them.
Wuthering Heights and all that jazz. Yeah, that's it exactly. They were all kind of doing that, including Anne, who wrote what's largely considered to, I think, be the first feminist novel ever published. And I can't remember the name of it right now. Hold, please. Okay, yes. So her second novel. So her first novel was called Agnes Grey, and it was published in 1847, at the same time as her sister's novel Wuthering Heights was published. And her second novel, which is called The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, was published in 1848, and it is often considered basically one of the first feminist novels ever written.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's
And she was under a male pseudonym when she wrote that.
I believe she would have been at the time, yes, under the pseudonym of Acton Bell.
Yeah.
That she published it under. Yeah, which is wild.
Yeah.
Like, pretty crazy that, like, way 1848, they're considering the first feminist, or one of the first feminist novels, I should say, was ever published. That's pretty wild.
That is pretty wild.
You know, and all these, God, all three of those sisters, like Anne, Emily, and Charlotte Bronte, Jesus. Talk about, like, a powerhouse of
Makes you wonder,
siblings.
like, what was going on at home that they were all such talented writers.
I don't know. And I mean, like, Anne, for instance, unfortunately, she passed away at only 29.
Oh, wow.
Of, most likely, they're saying most likely of pulmonary tuberculosis.
It sucks.
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, they all, I mean, granted, unfortunately, everybody died young, didn't they? It looks like Charlotte Bronte passed away at age 38.
Oh, wow.
And then... Let me see. And yeah, Emily passed away at age 30. Everybody was really fucking young. I can't believe the books that these women wrote before passing away at ridiculously young ages. It's wild.
Wow.
Crazy. People are impressive.
I mean,
Ladies have been impressive for a long time. They've definitely left their mark on the world, which is why they're... I forget which area of England that they're from, but there are, like, you know, like statues erected, I believe, in the town, like, in their honor and things, which... logical.
Yeah.
If you're gonna put one up of a man, you can also put one up of three, like, real, like, literary icons,
for
basically.
Sure. Yeah, and then as time progressed, you know, women obviously stopped using the male pseudonyms. They started, you know, writing in earnest under their names, and we started, you know, this story's coming to mind that I read. It was, I believe this was from actually the 1700s.
Sure.
Please hold.
So much fact-checking.
Which we should do before we start. Anyway, she wrote a story called A Mastectomy. And I can't find it right now. She was a very famous author at the time. And I'm blanking and I can't find anything right now. But... she wrote it at the time when they didn't have anesthesia.
Oh, okay.
And so this was like such a raw, like real story written by a woman about something that could only affect women. And so she had to have a mastectomy, and she did not have any anesthetic. No. She was awake the whole time.
Oh my God.
And she wrote this story about the whole situation. And I remember being so, like, I don't know, like, struck by the fact that her main concern was that she was making the male surgeons uncomfortable with her screams.
Jesus.
And I think this was, like really groundbreaking because at the time, like, it was really, like, an account of something that could only affect women.
Yes.
But then she wove in, like, her apologies to the male doctors.
Oh, my God.
It was just something interesting to read, like, from a social standpoint, that it was like, wow, like, she's still, like, you know, going with those social norms that you're expecting. Like, a woman must be, like, quiet and, like, you know,
so sorry
apologetic.
to have made you uncomfortable, writhing and like, screaming in pain because I had no anesthesia.
Exactly. But at the same time, like, you're like, wow, she really wrote something that could only affect women. Yes. And who was her audience, really?
Yeah,
you know?
Of course. Other than women, like, really, there would have been, like, a man reading that, particularly at that time, would have been very uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Yeah.
But anyway, I digress.
Yeah.
We've evolved a lot.
Yes. And I think also, obviously, like, you know, we're talking about a lot to do with, like, the 19th century and women coming into the sort of fold of publication a little bit more, and obviously I'm sure a lot of that does have to do with, like, the Industrial Revolution and, like, the printing press being invented, because of course women had access to actually having their work printed in greater volume. I mean, everyone did, men would have as well, but they actually had more access to, you know, having like printing presses and things that could get could get things done in greater volume, because it's not like things had to be physically written down. We're talking printing presses. Things are able to be printed on a piece of paper. The book is bound and then shipped out where it needs to go. So things, really sped up quite a lot. So I think it probably helped a lot from a distribution standpoint as well, that they were able to have more access to that as time went on as well.
Well, it allowed them to remain anonymous for longer if they wanted to. Yeah.
It's a very Lady Whistledown kind of situation.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking about too.
It's just every time she's got to go to she's got to go to the printing people and whatever, and just pretend that it's not really her who's doing it and stuff. It's like a whole thing. And I'm like, oh yeah.
That is what comes to mind.
It's true. But funny enough, so, if you kind of look, obviously, then, through the times, many things evolved. You have a lot of female authors who became massively successful. Virginia Woolf, Agatha Christie, all of those novelists who became, and still are to this day, incredibly, incredibly well known for their work. But it wasn't, despite all of this, and despite these women who were at the forefront of a lot of publication and a lot of what people enjoyed reading too, which is something that I think a lot of men were still back in the whole I'm going to write something very scholarly and very interesting and everything, and very long and drawn out. Women like Agatha Christie were I'm going to write a mystery because I think people like that shit.
And she was right.
And she was fucking right.
And then she created Miss Marple, and she created Poirot,
and just these stories and these characters that people know today, even without having really read any of the works. You've probably seen a movie. You've probably seen a made-for-TV adaptation.
Have you heard about the Murder on the Orient Express?
Yeah, that's it. Have you heard of, that's it. And then there were none, some of her really, really big ones. So despite all of this, it really wasn't until basically the 1970s when you had there was a huge second wave feminist movement that was occurring all over the world, very largely in the United States, but also just all over the world in general. That women in literature courses started to spring up in colleges and universities around, because up until this point this really hadn't existed. So if you think about it, that wasn't really that long ago.
It wasn't.
In our case, our parents were alive.
So it's true.
In the 1970s, think about that. Pretty sure my mom was in college in the 70s.
Yeah, there you go.
It's a crazy thought.
It really is. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about it, and I'm And I think that was, it's hard to say, because college in the 70s, we mentioned a moment ago that at first the women who were writing were the ones who were of the upper class, really, if we're being honest. And then if you think about the 70s, I was about to say, that's when it started to become a lot more accessible to a lot of women. Yeah. But then I'm I think they would have to be in college. To have these courses. For sure,
in a lot of cases. But at least, I guess, a lot of sort of things like the authors who were able to come before, who, were able to sort of break these barriers and be published and eventually be recognized under their own names as well, I think helped push this idea to the forefront. So when this huge feminist wave was occurring in the 60s and sort of early 70s, that's probably why finally, because we all know that education takes forever to catch up to what's current and what's going on. By the time, decades and decades had gone by, they were suddenly oh, hey, I guess we have enough material now that we can actually make an entire class that's just focused on female authors and female-led literature.
Women's studies.
Yes, exactly. That's it. And that was when a lot of those courses came into existence in the first place, was after around that time, because people were hey, I would like something for once that focuses, I would like to take a literature course where I'm not just reading the same 4 male authors over and fucking over again, where it's not just read some Dickens, read some Shakespeare, read some Hemingway, and read, God, I don't know, pick another annoying one and just go from there.
Pick another annoying one.
Pick another one and just go from it. You know what I mean? It's not just the same 4 or 5 that we're reusing over and over and over, like Milton or something. We're not just Paradise Lost. Everybody's read, that at some point or another. So it's not just picking the same 4 or 5 and going at the same thing over again. They were able to actually read these stories and read these stories from the perspective of the women who wrote them.
Yeah, and I think that that's like such a key component of it, right? Is, and again, going back to what George Eliot had said, you know, to read this from the perspective of being a woman enhances the story much more than just reading it.
Yes. You get a different, a different
with
read
male
on
pseudonym as well.
Yes, of course, yeah. It's a different read on the characters. It's a different read on the themes that are being presented in the novel. There is something to be said for, you know, even today, let's say, like, you know, if you read a book and enjoy it, for instance, without really paying attention to the author, which, like, a lot of us do. I do that all the time. If I pick up a book and it looks interesting, I don't really pay attention to who's written it necessarily, unless it's, like, a name that I already know. But, you know, if I really enjoy something, it can be interesting to look into the author themselves. Do they identify as male, female, or in certain cases, neither of those things as well? Because that can also give you a different read on the themes, on the characters in the story, and things now as well, which is, you know, it can be an interesting thing to learn along with, like, you know, learning about the author themselves, and then it kind of gives you your own perspective on the story that you've consumed as well.
Yeah, and I find that that's something really great about, you know, our whole, I guess, media culture and our culture around literature now is looking at, you know, where did this experience come from? Where did this voice come from? You know, and it's that, exactly like you said, you know, the intersectionality, that's become a big part of the conversation now. You know, do you have women of color writing? Do you have, you know, men of color writing? Is it indigenous? Is it, you know, is it somebody who identifies as they? Is it a trans person? You know, and so when you have that background, and again, like, something that's really great about our culture now is that we pay more attention to that.
Yeah, and I know that some people get annoyed because they're like, oh, it doesn't matter and stuff. But at the same time, you know what? I do understand. I get, like, you know, that sometimes people feel like it's too, I guess it's almost paid attention to too much, and maybe given too much merit to an extent. But at the same time, there has been such a long history of everything else being pushed to the side and considered lesser than and unimportant, that now being able to see such diversity in the literary world as far as people who are being published is a really positive change, and it just makes it so that it makes it so interesting. Like, I think people are thinking about this from a perspective of, you know, 30, 40, 50 years ago, the vast majority of books you were picking up were written by a white man.
Totally.
So, whereas now, you have this, like, sort of fascinating thing that happens when you pick up a book. Is this written by a woman? Is this written by a trans author, a non-binary author, an author of color? You know, and how has that affected their writing and the story they're telling as well?
And what can I learn about
a culture that I might not be familiar with?
Yep.
You know, and what can I take away from that I didn't know before, which is, I think, part of, like, the joys of reading is learning things as well.
Absolutely.
Yes, to be entertained, of course, obviously.
Yeah, but, like, you really learn to be really empathetic by reading a lot.
Yeah.
You know, literature, poetry, whatever. If you're reading enough from the perspective of someone who is not you and who has had very different experiences to how you have lived your life, naturally you're going to develop more of an empathy, and then you're going to start looking at the world through the eyes of other people.
Yeah.
So that's one of my favorite things about reading, is that effect that it has on me anyway as a person.
And there is something I do find oftentimes if I pick up, no matter, probably because I do identify as female, but when I pick up a book and I read it and I love it and it's written by a female author, there's just something about it that makes me happy.
Well, you feel kind of like a connection to that author, and then more connected to the story, and then that goes back to the importance of what we were just saying, is having those diverse voices. Like, it's that representation, right?
That matters. Yeah. Exactly. And that makes a difference in your experience as a reader as well. And I think the experience of the literary community as a whole, since so many people are are perfectly happy and willing to do the exact same thing that we're talking about, which is like, really look at authors who are outside of the scope of what would have been considered the norm 50 odd years ago.
Absolutely.
Yep. Love it. We love Women's History Month.
We do. Yay. Celebrate.
We love women being published everywhere. We love all of the celebrations of women who are getting to write these like beloved books that are being published, particularly in like many genres like fantasy and romance. Like these women who are having like these huge voices now, who are able to look at all of we were looking at some stuff yesterday for future episodes just to give us, like doing a little research like we do sometimes when we're brainstorming. And I was realizing how many upcoming projects there are for women who are having their fantasy properties turned into TV series, into movies, miniseries, whatever is happening. And the vast majority of those are written by women.
I know, it's really exciting.
You go to the young adult fantasy section at your local bookstore and it's all women who are publishing right now. And it's all women who are getting to be in the spotlight. And all you need usually, I find, is one or two properties that are adapted and that are adapted from series that people really love and that get a large audience. And it opens the door for so many more women to be able to do that. Like, I guarantee, give us like another couple of years, we're going to get another 1 or 2 seasons of Bridgerton and Regency romance. Those authors, their stuff's going to uptick the fucking through the roof.
I mean, look what happened with vampires, right?
Yes.
When Twilight came out, and then everything was vampires ages.
And again, largely written by women a lot of the time.
Harry Potter, written by a woman.
Yep, exactly.
Like, don't tell me that, like, women who wrote literature was aimed only at women. No, like,
absolutely
these are beloved by okay, maybe not Twilight, but like
it kind of is.
I love Twilight, but like
it kind of is. You know what? It wouldn't have the staying power that it has if people didn't kind of love it or love to hate it.
Right, but like Harry Potter is like for all audiences. We do not love J.K. Rowling. How dare you do that? But anyway.
Yeah, that's a depressing part. We're not going to talk about that because it's Women in Literature Month, and that's just going to get us onto a whole other track that we don't want to go into. So,
but yeah, she is still a woman who wrote Harry Potter that is beloved.
That is beloved by so many people.
By many.
Exactly. What do you guys love about like women in literature in general? Is there like a specific genre that you're drawn to? Like, do you like a cop thriller? Do you like a romance? Do you like a fantasy? Do you like a mystery story? Like, there's so many different things that you can get into. And there are a ton of women publishing in a ton of different genres, which makes me very happy that they're not just limited to romance, for instance.
No, I'm a sucker for a good young adult fantasy written by a woman.
Yeah, I love like a young adult mystery written by a female author. I don't know what that is specifically, but there's something, I guess probably because most of the time I can identify with the characters.
Yeah, for sure.
More often than not. That is really something that I just like enjoy, particularly when it's written by a female author. I just like it. So yeah, you guys can let us know about that over on Instagram at fullybookedca, or you can check out our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/book was way better. And if you're still here with us, and I hope that you are for now and all of the rest of Women in History and Women in Literature Month, please feel free to leave us a 5-star rating and review wherever you're listening, because it really helps us get the episodes out in front of more people. But until next week, guys, keep on reading.
Thanks, everyone.